every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The afternoon of June 9, 2017 was bright and unremarkable on the sprawling campus of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. It was the kind of early summer day, filled with the quiet hum of academia winding down, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and the promise of a peaceful weekend. For thousands of students, it was a day like any other, a day of finishing papers, of meeting friends, of making plans. For 26-year-old Yingying Zhang, it was a day of new beginnings. She was on her way to sign a lease for a new apartment, another small step in the grand, exciting journey that had brought her halfway across the world. Yingying was not just a student. She was a visiting scholar, a specialist in the photosynthesis of crops, a brilliant mind from a working-class family in Nanping, China. She was the first in her family to attend university, carrying the immense pride and hopes of her parents and younger brother. She was quiet, thoughtful, and fiercely determined. Friends described her as cautious, someone who would never take unnecessary risks. She was small in stature, but possessed an enormous intellect and a gentle, infectious optimism. Her journey to America was the culmination of a lifetime of work, a dream she had meticulously built through dedication and sacrifice. The university, with its stately brick buildings and manicured lawns, was supposed to be the safe, nurturing environment where that dream would flourish. At 1:40 that afternoon, Yingying stood at a bus stop on North Goodwin Avenue. She had just missed her bus and was running late. Text messages flew back and forth with the apartment manager. She was anxious but not panicked. This was a simple, solvable problem of urban life. As she waited, a black Saturn Astra sedan pulled up beside her. The driver was a young white man, seemingly another student or faculty member. Security footage, grainy and silent, captured the brief interaction, a conversation lasting just over a minute. The man gestures, explains something. Yingying hesitates, leans in to listen, then, in a fateful decision that remains impossible to fully comprehend, she walks around the front of the car and gets into the passenger seat. The Saturn Astra pulls away from the curb, merges with traffic, and disappears. And so did Yingying Zhang. What followed was not a gradual realization of dread, but a sudden, terrifying silence. When Yingying didn't show up to sign the lease, her friends began to worry. When she didn't answer her phone, worry turned to alarm. By that evening, a frantic search was underway, a search that would soon escalate into a massive federal investigation. How does a person, a cautious and intelligent young woman, simply vanish in the middle of a modern American university campus, an environment saturated with cameras, technology, and people? There was no sign of a struggle, no ransom note, no obvious motive. There was only the ghost of a black car, and a few pixels of video showing the last known moments of a beloved daughter's life. The void she left behind was absolute, and the question of what filled that void would lead investigators down a path into the darkest corners of the human psyche, a place where meticulous planning and monstrous fantasy converge. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a chillingly ordinary monster and the invisible digital threads that led investigators into the darkness. This is a case not defined by a bloody crime scene or a smoking gun, but by the meticulous reconstruction of a killer's secret world, a world built in browser histories, online forums, and whispered confessions recorded in secret. It is the story of how the most terrifying predators are often the ones hiding in plain sight, and how justice can hinge on a single horrifying conversation. The initial hours after Yingying Zhang's disappearance were a blur of confusion and escalating fear for her friends and her boyfriend, Zhaolin Hu, who was back in China but in constant contact with her. The apartment manager from One North, the complex where Yingying was headed, confirmed she never arrived. Her friends, knowing her punctuality and responsible nature, knew immediately that something was wrong. They went to her apartment, but she wasn't there. Her belongings were untouched. Her daily journal lay open, its last entry written with the same tidy precision that defined her life. The entries spoke of a young woman navigating a new culture, excited by her research, but also feeling the pangs of loneliness and the pressure to succeed. The final entry was filled with simple, hopeful plans. By 9:24 p.m. that Friday, the University of Illinois Police Department was officially notified. The initial response was standard procedure. Officers checked local hospitals and the county jail. They issued a bolo, "Be on the lookout," for Yingying. But as the night wore on and stretched into a cold, empty Saturday morning, the grim reality began to set in. This was not a simple case of a young woman getting lost or deciding to take an impromptu trip. This was a disappearance. The university police, recognizing the potential gravity of the situation, acted swiftly. They began the painstaking work of pulling security footage from every possible camera along Yingying's presumed route. This is where the digital investigation began, not with complex data forensics, but with the simple, tedious act of watching. They traced her path from her lab to one bus stop, then another. They saw her get off a bus, and then they found the crucial footage from the university's transportation hub. There she was, standing alone, waiting. And there it was, the black Saturn Astra. The image was a breakthrough, but also a formidable challenge. It was grainy, the license plate unreadable. All they had was the make, model, and color of the car. On Monday, June 12th, the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the case. The search for Yingying Zhang was now a major federal kidnapping investigation. The FBI released the surveillance image to the public, and the university announced a $40,000 reward for information. The plea was blasted across local news and social media. The public response was overwhelming, but sifting through the noise was a monumental task. The Illinois Secretary of State's database contained records for 18,000 black Saturn Astras registered in the state. As agents and analysts began the needle-in-a-haystack search of the vehicle database, a crucial piece of information surfaced from the initial police work. An officer reviewing the footage noticed something unique about the suspect vehicle. It had a cracked hubcap on the front passenger side. It was a tiny detail, almost unnoticeable, but it was the kind of specific feature that could narrow the search exponentially. The investigators cross-referenced the vehicle registration data with the university's own parking permit database. They were looking for a black Saturn Astra owned by someone in the campus community with a damaged hubcap. The query returned a single name, Brendt Christensen. Brendt Allen Christensen was, on paper, the epitome of a non-suspect. He was 27 years old, a recent master's graduate in physics from the very university at the center of the investigation. He was married, lived just a few miles from campus, and had no significant criminal record. He had been a brilliant student, a PhD candidate who had served as a graduate teaching assistant, even winning an award for his teaching excellence. He was, by all outward appearances, a quiet, intelligent, and unremarkable member of the academic community, the kind of person you would pass on the campus quad 100 times and never notice. On the evening of June 12, 3 days after Ying disappeared, police officers went to Christensen's apartment complex. They found the car. It was a black Saturn Astra, and it had a cracked front passenger hubcap. The following day, agents from the FBI's Springfield office arrived to question him. Christensen was cooperative, almost casually so. He invited them into his apartment. He admitted to owning the car and confirmed he had been driving it on the day of the disappearance. When asked about his whereabouts, he told them he had been at home all day, sleeping late and playing video games. He denied being anywhere near the bus stop where Ying was last seen. The agents left, but the seeds of suspicion had been planted. There was a discrepancy. The surveillance footage clearly showed his car picking up a young Asian woman. His alibi contradicted the video evidence. 2 days later, on June 15th, investigators returned. This time, they came with the footage. When confronted with the evidence of his car at the scene, Christensen's story changed. He now admitted he had been out driving. He claimed he saw a young Asian woman standing at the corner, looking distressed. He said he pulled over, offered her a ride, and she got in. He told the agents she said she was late for an appointment. According to this new version of the story, he drove her for several blocks, but she became panicked when he seemed to take a wrong turn. He said she asked to be let out of the car, and he complied, dropping her off in a residential neighborhood a few blocks from where he had picked her up. He then drove back to his apartment and went on with his day. It was a plausible, if slightly odd, story. It explained why his car was on the video, but it didn't feel right. The investigators noticed the car itself. When one of them leaned on the passenger door, they could smell that it had been cleaned with bleach. When they got a warrant to search the vehicle, their suspicions were amplified. The passenger side of the car, where Ying would have been sitting, had been cleaned more thoroughly than any other part of the vehicle. It was as if someone had tried to scrub away not just dirt, but evidence. The search of the car yielded nothing conclusive, no DNA, no blood, no fibers. But the absence of evidence was, in its own way, evidence itself. It pointed to a deliberate, conscious effort to erase a person's presence. The FBI placed Christensen under constant surveillance. They knew he was their man, but they had no body, no murder weapon, and no confession. They had a suspicious story and a clean car. It wasn't enough to prove a kidnapping, let alone a murder. To get inside his world, they needed to get inside his head, and the key to that was buried in his digital life. The warrants came next, for his phone, his computer, his online accounts. And as forensic analysts began to peel back the layers of his digital existence, the facade of the quiet, unremarkable physics student crumbled, revealing a dark and terrifying secret world. Brendt Christensen, it turned out, had been meticulously planning a crime long before he ever saw Ying Zhang waiting for a bus. The digital life of Brendt Christensen was a roadmap to murder. When FBI forensic specialists cloned the hard drive of his computer and the data from his phone, they uncovered a history that was not just disturbing, but methodical. It was the diary of a predator in training. The investigation into his online activity revealed two distinct but intertwined paths: his immersion in a deviant sexual subculture and his practical research into the mechanics of kidnapping and murder. On April 19, 2017, nearly 2 months before Ying's abduction, Christensen visited a fetish social networking site. On it, he viewed threads with titles like Perfect Abduction Fantasy and How to Abduct. He read detailed posts where users described elaborate scenarios of kidnapping, torture, and murder. He wasn't a passive observer. He was a student. He downloaded images depicting female victims of abduction, bound and gagged. This was not a fleeting curiosity. It was a sustained, obsessive interest. His search history was a litany of horror. He searched for terms like Abduction 101, a dark tutorial on the subject. He researched the best types of rope for bondage, the effectiveness of various restraints, and the legal definitions of abduction versus kidnapping. He was studying the craft. This online activity painted a chilling psychological portrait. Christensen was not a man who snapped. He was a man who planned. He was building a fantasy, brick by digital brick, and was now researching the tools and techniques to make that fantasy a reality. The image that emerged was of a man leading a stark double life. To the outside world, he was an academic, a husband, a teacher. But in the private, anonymous glow of his computer screen, he was something else entirely. He was a monster in incubation. While the digital forensics team was building this timeline of intent, the surveillance team was watching Christensen's every move in the real world. They saw him going about his daily life, buying groceries, going to the gym. He appeared calm, composed, even bored. It was a terrifying display of compartmentalization. He knew he was the primary suspect in a massive federal investigation, yet he betrayed no outward signs of stress. This unnerving composure only strengthened the investigators' belief that they were dealing with someone highly intelligent and dangerously methodical. But they were still at a standstill. They had motive and intent, documented in his search history. They had opportunity, placing him with the victim. But they had no body and no confession. Proving murder without the victim's remains is legally possible, but incredibly difficult. It requires overwhelming circumstantial evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person is deceased and that the defendant is the one who killed them. They needed more. They needed to hear it from his own mouth. This is where the investigation took a critical and dramatic turn. The key was not in Christensen's past, but in his present. His marriage to Michelle Zortman was failing. They were in an open relationship, and Christensen had a girlfriend, a woman named Tara Bullis. Bullis had met Christensen on a dating site earlier that year. She was aware of his marital problems and his struggles with alcohol. When the FBI approached her, she was initially shocked and disbelieving. The Brendt she knew was kind, intelligent, if a bit troubled. He couldn't be a kidnapper. But as investigators laid out the evidence, the car, the changing stories, the online history, her disbelief turned to horror. She agreed to cooperate. Tara Bullis was about to become the FBI's ear, their direct line into the mind of a killer. On June 16th, just a week after Yingying's disappearance, Tara Bullis wore a wire for the first time. She met with Christensen, her purse containing a small digital recording device. The conversations began innocently enough. They talked about his problems, the stress of the investigation. He complained about the FBI, calling them incompetent. He maintained his innocence, sticking to his second story that he had simply given a girl a ride and dropped her off. He seemed more annoyed than scared. But as the days went on and Tara continued to record their conversations, his tone began to shift. The facade began to crack. He started talking about what made an ideal victim. He spoke with a chilling detachment. Like a scientist discussing a specimen, he talked about his fascination with serial killers, mentioning Ted Bundy by name. He expressed admiration for their ability to evade capture. He was no longer just denying his involvement. He was beginning to hint at a darker truth, testing the waters with Tara, seeing how she would react. The pivotal moment in the entire investigation came on June 29, 2017. A walk and vigil for Yingying Zhang had been organized on the university campus. Thousands of people from the community attended, holding candles, sharing stories, and praying for her safe return. It was a powerful, emotional display of solidarity, and in the middle of that crowd, blending in with the concerned students and faculty, stood Brendt Christensen. With him was Tara Bullis, and her purse was recording everything. As they stood there, surrounded by posters bearing Yingying's smiling face, Christensen leaned in and began to speak. The audio from that recording is one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the annals of modern crime. He wasn't remorseful. He was proud. He pointed out people in the crowd to Tara, describing them as being similar to his ideal victim type. He bragged about his crime. He told her how easily he had lured Yingying into his car, simply by posing as an undercover police officer. He said, "They're not going to be able to prove a thing. I'm not going to tell them a thing." He reveled in the attention, the manhunt that he had single-handedly orchestrated. He saw the vigil not as a memorial for his victim, but as a tribute to his own dark success. But the most damning part was yet to come. Later that same day, in a series of secretly recorded conversations, Christensen finally gave the FBI the confession they had been desperately seeking. Believing he was in a safe space, confiding in his girlfriend, he dropped the act entirely. He laid out the events of June 9th in horrific, granular detail. He described how he had been cruising around, looking for a victim. He said he had been planning it for months. He saw Yingying at the bus stop and knew she was the one. After luring her into his car, he took her back to his apartment. He admitted that his wife was out of town for the weekend, giving him the time and privacy he needed. Inside the apartment, he held Yingying against her will. He described her fight for her life, her defiance. He spoke of it with a kind of perverse admiration. She was valiant, he told Tara. He then described in graphic, unspeakable detail how he had sexually assaulted her, beaten her with a baseball bat, and then decapitated her. He told Tara that he had disposed of her remains in multiple garbage bags, which he then threw into dumpsters around the Champaign-Urbana area. He boasted about how he had meticulously cleaned his apartment and his car to eliminate every trace of forensic evidence. He was confident he had committed the perfect crime. He told Tara that Yingying was his 13th victim, a claim investigators believe was likely a false boast, an attempt to build his own mythos as a prolific serial killer. He concluded his monstrous monologue with a line that would echo through the courtroom and haunt Yingying's family forever. He looked at Tara and said of Yingying, "She is gone, forever." The FBI had what it needed. The recordings were undeniable. It was a confession, detailed, brutal, and delivered with chilling pride. On June 30, 2017, 21 days after Yingying Zhang stepped into his car, Brendt Christensen was arrested and charged with her kidnapping. The charge would later be upgraded to kidnapping resulting in death. The manhunt was over, but the search for Yingying and the fight for justice had only just begun. The arrest of Brendt Christensen sent a shockwave through the university community and across the world. The quiet, unassuming PhD student was now the face of a monstrous crime. But for investigators and for Yingying Zhang's family, the arrest was only the first step in a long and arduous legal journey. The central, agonizing problem remained. Yingying's body had not been found, despite Christensen's recorded confession detailing the disposal of her remains. An extensive search of a local landfill, based on the timeline he provided, yielded nothing. The garbage had been compacted and buried under tons of other waste, making a recovery virtually impossible. This set the stage for a rare and challenging type of prosecution, a death penalty murder trial without the victim's body. The legal principle of corpus delicti, Latin for body of the crime, requires the prosecution to prove that a crime actually occurred. In a murder case, this traditionally means proving the victim is dead and that their death was caused by a criminal act. Without a body, the defense can argue that the alleged victim might still be alive, that they simply ran away or disappeared for other reasons. The prosecution's entire case would have to be built on a mountain of circumstantial evidence, anchored by Christensen's own horrifying words. The case, United States against Brendt A. Christensen, began in federal court in Peoria, Illinois in June of 2019, almost 2 years to the day after Yingying's disappearance. The federal government sought the death penalty, citing the exceptionally heinous, cruel, and depraved nature of the crime. Yingying's family, including her father, mother, and brother, traveled from China to attend the trial. They sat in the front row of the courtroom every single day, listening through translators to the soul-crushing details of their daughter's last moments, hoping for justice and, above all, for answers about where she was. The trial began with a stunning and unexpected move from the defense. In his opening statement, Christensen's attorney George Tessef stood before the jury and said, "Brendt Christensen is responsible for the death of Yingying Zhang. Brendt Christensen killed Yingying Zhang." It was a shocking admission, a complete reversal of the not guilty plea Christensen had maintained for 2 years. The defense's strategy was clear. This would not be a trial about guilt or innocence. It would be a trial about punishment. By conceding the act of murder, they hoped to focus the jury's attention on Christensen's state of mind, his personal history, and a myriad of mitigating factors, all in a desperate bid to save him from the death penalty. They were not trying to free him. They were trying to keep him alive. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Eugene Miller, proceeded to lay out its case methodically, building a wall of evidence so high that the defense's admission of guilt seemed almost redundant. They began with the last images of Yingying, the grainy surveillance footage of her getting into the Saturn Astra. They showed the jury Christensen's initial lies to the police, and how his story changed only when he was confronted with irrefutable proof. They presented the forensic evidence, or lack thereof, from his car and apartment, explaining how the obsessive-compulsive level of cleaning was in itself evidence of a cover-up. Then they took the jury into Christensen's digital world. They detailed his deep dive into the darkest corners of the Internet. Jurors saw the screenshots from the fetish website, the titles of the abduction fantasy forums he frequented, the cold, calculated search terms he had used to plan his crime. This evidence was crucial, as it dismantled any potential argument that this was a crime of passion or a spontaneous act. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had fantasized, researched, and rehearsed this abduction for months. The emotional centerpiece of the trial, however, was the audio recordings. The courtroom fell silent as the jury listened to Brendt Christensen's own voice describe the murder. They heard him brag to Tara Bullis at the vigil, his words a chilling counterpoint to the sounds of a grieving community in the background. Then they heard the full, unvarnished confession. They heard him describe Yingying's final, desperate struggle for life. They heard him call her valiant, before detailing how he overpowered and killed her. They heard him boast that he was a serial killer, that he was good at it, that no one would ever find her. For Yingying's family, it was almost unbearable. her father, Ronggao, often had to leave the courtroom, overcome with a grief so profound it was physically painful. Through a family spokesperson, he expressed their singular wish to know where his daughter was, to bring her home to rest. The defense did not contest the facts of the crime. Instead, they tried to build a narrative of a man in crisis. They argued that Christensen was a brilliant academic whose life had spiraled out of control. They brought witnesses who testified about his heavy drinking and use of antidepressants. His ex-wife, Michelle Zortman, testified that their marriage had been crumbling, and that Christensen had struggled with night terrors and suicidal thoughts. They portrayed him as a man grappling with mental illness, marital strife, and academic failure, a perfect storm that, they argued, diminished his moral culpability. Their goal was to make the jury see not a monster, but a broken human being. They hoped to find just one juror who would feel enough sympathy or have enough doubt about the death penalty to spare his life. After 2 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. The verdict on his guilt was a foregone conclusion, given the defense's own admission. After just 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts, kidnapping resulting in death, and 2 counts of making false statements to the FBI. The trial then moved into the penalty phase. This was the real battle. The prosecution and defense presented arguments for and against the death penalty. The prosecution recounted the horrific details of the crime, emphasizing the torture and suffering Yingying endured. They presented a victim impact statement from her family. Her boyfriend, Zhaolin Hu, spoke of their plans to get married. Her father spoke of the void in their lives, the constant, gnawing pain of not knowing where she lay. He said, "Our dream has been shattered. I hope you can feel the pain we feel." The defense, in turn, presented their mitigating factors. They brought Christensen's father and sister to the stand, who spoke of a troubled but loving son and brother. They argued that a sentence of life in prison without parole would be a sufficient punishment, ensuring he would die behind bars, never again a threat to society. The decision rested with the 12 jurors. For the death penalty to be imposed, their decision had to be unanimous. If even one juror voted against it, the sentence would automatically default to life in prison. On July 18, 2019, after more than 8 hours of deliberation spread over 2 days, the jury sent a note to the judge. They were deadlocked. They could not reach a unanimous decision. Under federal law, the outcome was sealed. Brendt Christensen would not be executed. The judge formally sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, there was a quiet gasp. Christensen showed no emotion. Yingying's mother collapsed in sobs. Her father sat stoically, his face a mask of grief and disbelief. They had received a guilty verdict, but they had been denied the ultimate measure of justice they had sought, and they still did not have their daughter. After the sentencing, in a final, cruel twist, information was released that had been sealed under an immunity agreement with the prosecution. Months before the trial, Christensen's lawyers had met with prosecutors and detailed the final disposition of Yingying's remains, based on what their client had told them. The information was provided in the hope of securing a plea deal for life in prison, a deal the government rejected, choosing instead to pursue the death penalty. According to Christensen's lawyers, after killing Yingying in his apartment, he placed her dismembered remains into 3 separate garbage bags. The next day, he drove to various locations around the Champaign-Urbana area and disposed of the bags in different dumpsters. His personal belongings, including the baseball bat he used to kill her and the clothes she was wearing, were also bagged and thrown away separately. The garbage from those dumpsters was taken to a private landfill in Danville, Illinois, where it was compacted at least twice and buried under 30 feet of other refuse. A recovery, the lawyers confirmed, was impossible. The information, held back until after the trial, confirmed the family's worst fears. There would be no grave to visit, no final homecoming. The case of Yingying Zhang is a study in contrasts. It is about the contrast between a life full of promise and a life consumed by dark fantasy. It is about the contrast between a family's unwavering love and a killer's absolute absence of empathy. But most of all, it is about the contrast between the visible world and the invisible one. Yingying disappeared in a visible, public space, yet her fate was sealed in the invisible private world of her killer's apartment and his even more private digital life. The anatomy of this crime is not found in a single piece of forensic evidence, but in the sprawling dark architecture of a digital mind. Brendt Christensen built his crime, piece by piece, in the anonymous echo chambers of the Internet. His browser history was his blueprint. His search terms were his shopping list. He rehearsed his violence in the realm of fantasy long before he enacted it in the physical world. The investigation succeeded not by finding a fingerprint on a weapon, but by following a trail of pixels and whispered confessions. It was a testament to the power of modern surveillance and digital forensics, tools that allowed the FBI to walk through the corridors of Christensen's mind and watch him build his own cage. And yet, for all its technological sophistication, the investigation ultimately ran into the brutal physical limitations of the real world. The same meticulous planning that allowed Christensen to craft his online persona as a predator also enabled him to dispose of his victim so thoroughly that she may never be found. He confessed to the how and the why, but he successfully denied his victim's family the where. He was captured by a wire, but Yingying was lost to a landfill. Brendt Christensen now resides at a high-security federal penitentiary, where he will remain for the rest of his life. For the legal system, the case is closed, but the story remains unfinished. The final brutal truth of the crime, the location of Yingying's remains, is a secret that died with his conviction, locked away under layers of legal privilege and tons of garbage. In the end, the digital trail led to the man, but not to the victim, and for the Zhang family, the case remains an open wound, a story without a final chapter, a search for a daughter who exists now only in memory, and as a silent, unanswered question scattered in the dust of an Illinois landfill. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.